Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm happy and honored to be here. So I want to thank Rebecca and the coalition. And I'm super excited about the news with the Family Justice Center. This is great timing to be here today, to come with all of you who wants to learn more. And then in particular with the focus of partnership and how critical that is as we want to move forward and serve and support and uplift survivors of trafficking. We can go ahead with the first slide. And we can actually go with objectives. I'm really here today. Rebecca had asked us to talk very specifically about privilege and confidentiality. I'm just curious, folks that are in the room, how many of you already have or are aware that you might have some type of privilege in your own work, whether you're domestic violence, sexual assault caseworker, or human trafficking caseworker? Thank you. Okay, got it. Thanks. Thanks for sharing that. So we're going to talk about, generally, what are the definitions of confidentiality and privilege, looking at it from attorney to caseworker to law enforcement, interpreters, victims and survivors themselves, and then what traffickers actually do to try to break down that privilege and that confidentiality. Let me just look here on my notes. And let me just share, so this is, it sounds like a heavy topic, and I'm going to try to make it not so heavy, but please shout out if there are any questions. This is something that comes up in my work on a regular basis as an attorney from day one, whether I was working with survivors of trafficking or any type of other victim of crime. Just got a call earlier this week from a individual who was working for a sexual assault organization, and they said that they have a referral, and they wanted to know how to do the referral process. So I was briefly talking with them, and I told them, hey, this is what you need to do to refer to Justice at Last, and you need to make sure that you have consent from your client before you do the referral. And they were like, what? What do you mean? What do I have to ask? I have to ask them permission to give their information to you? Yes. So that's why we're here today. This is relevant. We might not think about it in our day-to-day job. We get so determined that we want to support this survivor and we want to do what we think is right. But there's actually laws that protect survivors' rights and privacy rights of individuals. So this is something that is near and dear to me. So we can go on to the next slide. So a little bit just about Justice at Last. We're a non-profit law firm. We've been doing the work for over 10 years, exclusively working with survivors of trafficking, regardless of age. The youngest client we ever represented was age 7. Our oldest client right now is age 77. We represent survivors, whether they're U.S. citizens or immigrants, regardless of their gender or sex identification, regardless of whether they were sex and or labor trafficked. And we're mobile. We're trying to break down barriers to meet clients where they're at, to make sure that they get access and find out what their rights are so they can move forward and they can make informed choices. We can probably go on to the next slide. These are just the services that we talk about. And first and foremost, I think I identify as a crime victim rights attorney. And just so everybody knows, if you're a victim of any crime, it doesn't have to be human trafficking, you have rights. Most of us don't know that. Like we hear when we watch TV all the time, if you're accused of a crime, you have a right to an attorney and one will be provided for you if you can't afford one. We don't hear that about the victims and victim rights. Victims have rights to attorneys. However, in our community and society right now, an attorney will not be provided to you if you can't afford one. So we do this work, and that's one of the things that we're most passionate about. But you can see the different types of legal services. We're kind of like a general practice law firm. So we can go to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about protecting privilege. So what does that mean? What is confidentiality? I would say, think of confidentiality as like an expectation. You're having a conversation with your doctor. There's an expectation there that that information you're sharing with your doctor is going to be kept confidential, right? You have this understanding that that information you're sharing with your doctor is not going to be publicly shared. And when we're talking about a privilege, think about a statute. This is something that is protected in law, that a person based on their profession has a duty to uphold. And then privacy, right? They're all intertwined, but we have this sense of what is a right to privacy. But why is this so important? I think it's what we've heard with a constant theme throughout from the other speakers, is to build trust. How are we going to support and serve survivors of trafficking if they don't trust us? If they don't know that we're going to protect what they're sharing to us and uphold to that? And it's really important, just with what I had briefly shared earlier about this well-intentioned advocate potentially could have inadvertently released confidential and privileged information to me or to somebody else. Because as the story went on, when I was continuing to talk with the advocate, they said that first they had talked to law enforcement about this individual, the survivor they were trying to support. And the law enforcement officer said, this survivor needs to talk with an attorney. And so again, the advocate was asking me, why? Why do they need to talk to an attorney? Often survivors of trafficking are forced to commit crimes, so they might actually have a criminal record. So it's really important before we take this initiative to say, oh, well, you need to talk to law enforcement. You need to report what has happened. We need to make sure that the survivor has spoken with an attorney so they, know what their rights are, because they might be incriminating themselves as they come forward to talk. So we can keep it on that slide. It just briefly breaks down privilege, confidentiality, privacy. I think kind of already touched a little bit about that. There's other confidentialities, as I mentioned about the doctor, there's therapist, financial institutions. I just wanted to make sure. I think we covered them all. Okay, so good. Thank you. And I guess I'm sorry, I didn't even realize I can look straight ahead. Okay, here we go. So there's some of this is going to be asking you for some interaction. What is privilege? It's a legal courtroom rule. So I kind of already touched on this. And then we're going to go back to the previous slide that protects confidential communications between a client and certain professionals. So if we could go to the previous slide. Thank you. So just a shout out, what are folks thinking? What is going to be the strongest to the weakest when we're talking about confidentiality, talking about privilege? And it can just be a guess. There's not going to be, there'll be a recognition for you taking the step, the courage to shout it out. Anybody want to guess? B, thank you. Yes, attorney-client privilege. That is the strongest. And then domestic violence, counselor privilege. And do you know what the weakest one is? It's not in this order, but it's the human trafficking caseworker privilege. So I don't know if anybody has taken the time to compare the different privileges or the requirements to get to rise to that level. But unfortunately, the human trafficking caseworker privilege is the weakest out of all of them. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So the elements of privilege, there we go, thank you. Here's a quick graph. But when can this be waived, and how does it get waived? And what does that mean when it is waived? So if there's a communication that's taking place and it's not in a private setting, so maybe you were just in court and the survivor that you're supporting just went in and testified, and now they're outside, testimony's over, and they're walking down the court steps, and they start telling you some additional information that they hadn't shared while they were on the stand. Is that in a private setting? They're on the outside public steps of the courthouse. It's not. So what does that mean? So they've waived whatever communication that has just been shared, because somebody might have just walked by and actually heard that snippet of that conversation. So that means that that particular communication, even if it was with their attorney, is no longer a privileged communication. There's been a waiver. And so waivers happen inadvertently from survivors themselves, but then also the professionals that are working with them. So for instance, maybe you want to do a referral. And so you send an email, or maybe it's not even a referral. Maybe you're just trying to get the survivor you're working with a connection to services. And you reach out to a bank because you're hoping the bank will bank with them. And you send this email. You don't disclose the client's name, but you do sign it, or maybe you do just share the name. But then you sign it that you are the human trafficking caseworker. Have you now waived? Like, have you violated whatever information that you were trying to do to support your client? So it's really important when we're talking about privilege and confidentiality and you're communicating with organizations or agencies outside of your entity that you understand what those rules and regulations are and what those statutes are. So here's just a quick example. A client asks you and says, can I bring my aunt with me to my intake? Is that okay? And so you'll say, well, why do you want your aunt there? And the response is, well, her English is much better than mine. And so when I have trouble sharing, I will let her know what I want to say and she will share it back to you. How do you respond to that? Is there going to be, there's no longer this confidential conversation. We've got a third person there, but the third person is a member of their family. What does that mean? If the interpreter has actually been hired through the agency itself or through the attorney, then there's protections. But now that you've had a third person who is even a family member, there's no longer this privilege. There's no longer, it's been waived, the confidentiality. And so potentially that third person, the aunt who they trust, could get a subpoena to come to court to testify. So it impacts survivors on many different levels, and not just for human trafficking, but the focus here today is human trafficking. We can go to the next slide. When we're talking about privileges, this is within whatever court system we're in, whether it's at the federal level, at the state level, even if we're looking at immigration court, they still exist. And so the next slide just briefly talks a little bit more about the different types of privileges. So I'm gonna just have you look at this for a moment, and somebody please shout out for me, who's missing from this list? Is there somebody missing from this list? Is there somebody you think that should be included, or that you think it is missing? Law enforcement's not on the list. Why not? It's a trick question. So criminal law enforcement, civil law enforcement, whether it's a prosecutor, an agent, an investigator, an officer, someone from the victim witness unit, if the victim witness unit is part of the district attorney's office, there's no attorney-client privilege. So we really need to pay attention to that and understand that when we're supporting survivors and they want to make a statement to law enforcement. They run a report, they're trafficking. Again, attorney-client privilege is the highest privilege that there can be. Attorneys might get subpoenaed, but they're likely not going to have to go testify against their own client, but a caseworker will. Caseworker's privilege is not going to rise to that level, and we have seen, unfortunately, human trafficking caseworkers or sexual assault or domestic violence advocates who are doing their job have to go to court and testify about what a client said. So that can actually do more harm. So again, it's really important to understand what these privileges and confidentialities are and what they look like. So what does happen if a client wants to report? Ideally, as a crime victim rights attorney, I want to be there. And you should too. You should make sure that you are coordinating with your local, either pro bono attorneys or crime victim rights attorneys, because they are going to be looking out for the rights and enforcing the rights of survivors of trafficking. If that is not possible, then you really have to pay attention about how you are acting as an advocate in that room when the statement is being made. Because again, potentially as a case manager or an advocate, you very well could get a subpoena to go testify. So you want to be mindful of the notes that you're taking. Take minimal notes, if any at all, because that could also be part of the subpoena where you have to turn in those notes. And then remember, if your client might, the slightest chance, have been involved in the trafficking itself, aside from being victimized, did they do any recruitment? Did they actually traffic as well? So then there's this criminal liability. So they most certainly need to not only talk to a crime victim rights attorney, but potentially a public defender who's going to be able to support them and let them know what their rights are before they make that statement to law enforcement. We can go on to the next. Thank you. So who owns that privilege? So it's the survivor. The survivor, even for a minor, they're the ones that own the privilege. It's not the attorney. It's not the advocate. It's who you're working with, supporting, and advocating for. So the survivor can decide, and they might give their consent and say, yes, it's okay. You can go ahead and do the referral. I'll sign the ROI for you so that you can get me connected to whatever services there are. But without that consent and without that release, potentially the individual, if the survivor themselves hasn't formally waived and allowed for it to happen, then you're in violation. And so it's really important when we're working with survivors from multi-victim cases. I don't know if Santa Cruz or in the surrounding area has seen multi-victim cases. So then there's a lot of potential conflict, and you want to make sure that you've got one advocate, and one advocate is supporting 10 different victims. There can be a lot of challenges with the privileges because the survivors themselves will be talking directly to you about the other survivors. So again, make sure that you're acquainted with either local pro bono counsel or a legal aid when you're working with and supporting clients in multi-victim cases. So why does privilege matter? Thank you. Because it kind of goes about what we've already been talking about, this theme of we want the survivors to trust us so we can best serve and support them. But it allows them to speak freely, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process and it takes time. But if they know that they can trust you and they can rely on you, and I think Francesca said, it's not a matter of the service itself, it's just that connection. If they feel they've made a connection and they can come back and they feel that they can trust you, the best way to do that is to be transparent about your role, your limitations, about what can be protected in terms of the communications. It just allows the survivor to feel trusted and supported. So we're going to go to the next slide, and it's going to be a scenario. So there's quite a few scenarios that are in here. Detective wants to be a team player, and he wants to put less of a burden on you as the advocate and your client. So the detective asks you for the client's Facebook account info so they can contact them directly. So if you're in this situation, what do you do? Say, no, thank you. Yes, hell no. Or a polite no, but I appreciate the offer. And I will get back to you about whether they are willing to speak with you directly. And so, but unfortunately, we have seen it where there's this pressure. We have coalitions, right? We have task force, and law enforcement is involved. And we genuinely all want the same thing, right? We all want for the survivor to get access to justice. But that doesn't mean, as an advocate, I know what's better for my client. My client is the one that knows what's best for them. So we always need to go back to the survivor we're supporting. We can go to the next slide. I might speed some of these up because this talks more about the domestic violence counselor, victim privilege, and then it compares it to the sexual assault and the human trafficking caseworker. Probably will not spend much time on this because this is in the PowerPoint itself and you'll have access to it. But it just breaks down the requirements of how to qualify for domestic violence counselor. And there's at least 40 hours of training. and you have to be working or volunteering for a domestic violence or gender-based violence agency. We can go to the next slide. It just breaks down the different types of training that you have to get exposed to over that 40-hour period. And then the next slide talks very specifically about the sexual assault counselor victim privilege as well. The privileges themselves between domestic violence and sexual assault are very similar. The next slide also talks about the breakdown of the particular training, the themes that have to be covered. And then the following slide is about the human trafficking caseworker privilege. So this is the newest privilege that was created. It's not that old, but again, it's very weak. And so I would encourage you, depending on the agency you're working for, if you're already been identified as a domestic violence, you're certified already, and you're supporting survivors of trafficking, that is even better than if you just got the human trafficking caseworker privilege. But it's something that we have, and it's a start based on what California laws are moving forward towards, in particular to serve and support survivors of trafficking. We can go to the next slide. It's really complex about who qualifies, and it's very similar in that you have to have 40 hours of training. Justice at Last does the certified training, but at this point, we've only offered it twice because there isn't a lot of people raising their hand to get this particular caseworker privilege certification just because of the weakness of it. So we can go on to the next slide, and that kind of just compares all of the different evidence codes in particular. And because we're running late on time anyway, I'm just going to pass and skip those. And we'll go to the next slide. There we go. All right, so let's actually say, okay, which is not a confidential communication? So I'll read these out loud, but I'm looking for audience participation here. Okay, client tells you their name and phone number and tells you that it is not a safe phone number. Or B, during your check-in, you observe that the client is disheveled and describe the appearance in your case notes. Or C, the client tells you that they're still in love with their exploiter. Or D, outside of the empty public courthouse, client tells you that they remember more details of the trafficking locations. Okay, thank you. So, and why is it not confidential? Because we're outside, we're in the public. Anybody, even if you do a turnaround and you're like, it's good, we can talk right now, there's still somebody listening, and plus you're in front of the courthouse. So I guarantee there is footage. There's a camera that's potentially watching. So great, thank you, thanks for that. Okay, so now we're gonna go to, thank you for the next slide. The California Penal Code, section 13750. So you were all, as you registered, you had to go through the survey and answer the questions that Rebecca had put together. And so I wanted to share this slide about the feedback, and thank you for your transparency, because even when Rebecca asked me, are you familiar with this penal code? I said, no, I am not. That's first of all, for Justice at Last, we are housed, and we have 4 offices throughout the Bay Area, one of which we're in a family justice center, and we support many family justice centers with partnerships throughout the Bay. But we are not, in the facility ever running a justice center. So I had to look it up. And so again, thank you for your honesty. I want to share with you why I do think it's important, and I want to recognize Rebecca for bringing it up to make sure that you all are aware in the community. So this section, this penal code, explicitly states that victims cannot be required to participate in the criminal justice system or to cooperate with law enforcement as a condition to get services with the Family Justice Center. So family justice centers are phenomenal, right? That's like we've heard a little bit about, and Julie's going to talk a little bit more so we can get a better sense of what's going to be happening or what is currently happening. But it's often made up of county agencies will have a presence in the Family Justice Center, but so will service providers. And it's very similar to what Francesca was talking about this hub, right? That we have like a one-stop shop. A survivor comes in for one service, and maybe they get connected to another provider. So it's really important that all family justice centers in the state of California There cannot be that requirement that they have to have reported their victimhood, that they can be able to access and get services without going through the criminal process system. The other thing that's great about this penal code is when there is a family justice center that's created, it has to assist all victims, and then it breaks down the victims by listing them: domestic violence, sexual assault, elder or dependent, adult abuse, human trafficking. And it's doing that in our evidence code because the state does recognize these forms of victimhood. So that's all the evidence code. So now we're going to go into some actual shared learning. And we can go to the next slide. So I'm looking here for audience engagement. Local detective wants to interview your client about their trafficking. Client's very scared, and they want you to stay in the room as their advocate to support them. What do you do? Oh, sorry, law enforcement agency. Yeah, so law enforcement has asked for the interview, and so the survivor's asking you as you're my advocate. Yes. And you're yes, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely allowed. You have a right to that. Domestic violence, sexual assault, and the law just recently changed that in the state of California, if there is a survivor that is identifying as being human trafficked, has a right to an advocate with them. So that is great. Yeah, absolutely. Ideally, as a crime victim rights attorney, I would want an attorney in the room. Why? Because that advocate could potentially get subpoenaed. And not just about that conversation in the reporting with law enforcement, the entire course of the support and services that advocate has been provided. And then also having an attorney there to maybe potentially stop the investigation if it's inappropriate, and or to make sure that the survivor knows their rights as they walk in and make a statement to law enforcement. So thank you for the engagement. Here's another scenario. Law enforcement needs your help. A local task force officer requests information about your client. They want confirmation that the client was suspended from her university for plagiarism. You want to show your support to the officer, so you ask the client if she was ever suspended or accused of plagiarism. The client confides that she had been suspended, but since has been reinstated, and she requests that information be not shared with anyone. So what do? You don't share, right? And this seems obvious. These are all scenarios that have happened over the course of our work with representing survivors. So in this instance, a well-intentioned advocate felt that she was doing the right thing and directly reported to law enforcement this survivor and what had happened. And so what is the repercussion of that? Not only have they violated whatever privilege and confidentiality, what has happened to the survivor? They're not believed, right? Because law enforcement knows now that if you're accused of plagiarism, that means you're not truthful. And so they're no longer deemed a victim. But what happens to the survivor from there? Sorry? Exactly. Thank you, Rebecca. There's no trust. If my advocate that I have shared something with and I've specifically said, I don't want anybody else to know this, and then exactly from that next step, that advocate goes and talks to law enforcement, I'm walking away and I'm not coming back. I will not be interacting with that agency again. And so I'm sharing this because there's so much harm in these well-intentioned actions that we take that we really have to be mindful, not just about the law and the evidence codes, but also about what we're doing. Ultimately, we want to support and uplift survivors. We don't want to harm them. Remember, they know what's best. It's our job to let them know what their rights are so that they can make informed decisions. It's not to make decisions for them and to take action for them. Thank you. We can go on to the next one. So I think we've got two more of these. So here's a client's plea. Client has started engaging with the trafficker. Client has responded is responding by text message. Client is embarrassed that they started talking to the trafficker again and does not want to tell their attorney, but you are their advocate. The client is worried that this will hurt their legal case. So the client asks you as the advocate, can you please talk to my attorney and tell my attorney what has happened? What do you do with this? Please, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And did everybody was able to hear that response in terms of, to offer to go with her? And I think that's right. I mean, I think the other part about, being transparent with our own privileges and confidentialities of what we can and cannot do. We also want to encourage the survivor to let them know what their rights are and what your role is as an advocate, if you are an advocate. The challenge with it coming with the client to an attorney conversation is there's no longer this confidentiality amongst the attorney and the client. So then potentially the advocate could get subpoenaed as well. But we do know that, especially for first-time meetings and maybe even a second, survivors often want support. And they want support with somebody they have initially connected with that they feel trusted to. And working with an attorney can be intimidating, right? That's one of the reasons why Justice at Last goes and meets clients where they're at. Yes, we have offices throughout the Bay, but clients don't come to us because that's intimidating. You want to go somewhere where you feel safe and you already are familiar with the supportive services. So it's not unusual for clients to initially want their advocate with them. And so we just want to be mindful as attorneys to make sure that they understand that they're waiving their privilege that they might have. And the last slide we have for scenarios. So during the car ride, and this is again as if you're an advocate, accompanying a client to get their identification, client says to the case manager, I want my exploiter or my trafficker to suffer for what they did. I have nightmares and they've ruined my life. I wish they were dead. What do you do with that statement, with that disclosure? Nothing. Exactly. Thank you. Later, the case manager learns that the exploiter comes up missing. If you are that advocate or caseworker, what are your next steps? Nothing. This is exactly right. So thank you. Later, the case manager learns that the exploiter has been murdered. What do you do now with this new information? Nothing. Right. So then why do I get calls from shelters and advocates asking these are identical questions that we get called for? So I think it's, again, these well-intentioned, as an advocate, as a case manager, that we feel that we need to do, that we have to do. We need to recheck ourselves. We need to ground ourselves and make sure we know what our role is. Our role is limited. Our role is to support and uplift. Our role is to make sure that the survivor knows what their rights are. Our role is not to be reporting directly to law enforcement what may or may not have happened, right? Just because these facts happen doesn't necessarily mean that they're connected. Please, yeah. And so that's a lot. There's a lot in there, but additionally with I'm going to kill him. So there are some instances where the privilege and confidentiality can be waived, in particular with a duty to give notice of harm. Like potentially, it depends on how planned out that murder sounds like. But that's astonishing, right? We're supporting somebody and they tell us, I've got a gun and I'm going to kill somebody. Like what? Again, we're human, right? We're going to want to do something as soon as we hear this information. Recheck, what is your role? You know, maybe at that point you need to check in with your supervisor at your agency. What do I do going forward? If you literally are seeing the gun, right? Like there's a lot of different possibilities there. But then there are instances where that can be broken for the sake of harm, or to give notice of potential harm. Yeah. It's different for attorneys, but it's still very similar. And sometimes things like this happen. All right, so strategies to protect privilege. What can we do to actually ensure that we are supporting the survivor? So if we're going to reach out to law enforcement or we're doing a referral to another service provider, you don't want to give detailed and specific information. And we've heard this, like even just French, this has been repeated before, right? Just, oh, I have a referral. Survivors labor trafficked. They were labor trafficked in Salinas. So at least that's enough information for that service provider to understand, like, what are the next steps. Don't go into any detail. Don't identify the client unless you have that ROI, that you've already got your client's consent and they have said to you, yes, I want a connection to talk to an attorney. Please do the referral. And then what you want to make sure is that the survivor themselves understand what these rights are. But maybe we're talking about a shelter, like a safe house shelter, right? So they need to understand their own repercussions if they are disclosing where they live. So this is just not a one-off conversation. This is a conversation you should be having on a regular basis when you're meeting with your clients, the survivor that you're trying to support. And if you're a mandated reporter, just don't mention it once, right? The next time you have a conversation, the following month. And by the way, I'm a mandated reporter. The truth is, when survivors of any crime want to share, they're going to share, even if you have told them. But often, sometimes, they're only told once when they first met, usually, not always, but often right after that traumatic, violent exploitation and trafficking has occurred. And so just because you told me 48 hours ago, I was in so much trauma, I don't even remember half of the conversation we had. So I need to hear it again, that you are a mandated reporter. Just be transparent with your clients, the survivors you're supporting. All right, so then we've got the next slide, summary and best practices. Kind of already talked about it. Make sure that you're educating the survivor about the differences between confidentiality and privilege and the limitations. Make sure that you're obtaining the written consent for release, and develop a media plan with the client you're supporting, because often they still might be on social media and they're reporting, not thinking necessarily that they are, oh, I just met with my attorney today. My attorney said XYZ. This is now posted on social media. That now by the survivor has been waived. There is no privilege or confidentiality because they just shared it. So make sure they understand that. And then make sure that you're helping the survivor to balance safety with healing. And we got, I think the next one is another summary of best practices. I think, yeah, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to briefly talk here about traffickers' tactics, because traffickers are always going to try to get whatever information they can to harm the survivor, to either prevent them from going to testify, to harass them, whatever it might mean. So you want to make sure that your survivor that you're working with understands that the defense attorney for the trafficker, whoever they've hired, might reach out to them. And they might not disclose that I'm the investigator for the defense. They're going to say, I'm an investigator. Can you answer some questions for me? And so the survivor is going to say yes, because they're assuming that they're law enforcement. Or they might reach out to family members. So again, it's this, you want to make sure that the client that you're supporting is informed. And often what we have seen is traffickers will intentionally try to call attorneys so they can conflict out. So they'll reach out to an attorney, they'll talk about the case acting as if they want counsel. And when the legal aid or the defense attorney, whoever it might be, will say, sorry, we can't represent you. When the victim turns around, the survivor that you're supporting reaches out to the same law firm, they've been conflicted out, they will no longer be able to represent. These are all tactics we see on a regular basis by traffickers. This was already talked about, but traffickers use spyware and technology to track what survivors are saying on social media and where they are. So we already probably know that in the room, but just to make sure, as a reminder to your clients that you're supporting. The next slide is, it says Q&A, but it's actually me asking you a question. What are you going to do if you or your agency gets a subpoena to provide information about a survivor you're supporting? What do you do? Call a lawyer. Yeah. Sorry. I mean, that's always going to be my answer, right? But I appreciate the question, because the truth is it's complex, right? And people panic. I've got a subpoena. I have to do what it says. No, not necessarily. It might not be valid, maybe the way they served it, or maybe the questions they're asking are inappropriate and would violate crime victim rights. So not that I'm trying to plug work for myself, but there are good attorneys out there that are, doing this work. And I think it's important that we tap in, because we want to protect the survivor, but we also want to protect our team, right? We don't want to have our staff having to go to court and worry about what's going to happen. And if they do have to go to court to testify, we want them prepared. We want them to know what they can and cannot say on the stand.